happy Moon Festival for you. I mean, it's yesterday, but I want to say
Oh,
that.
thank you very much. Yes, yes, I think we can probably still. I haven't got any moon cakes, but I must see if I can get some.
Yeah.
We have a Chinatown in London, and they sell moon cakes,
Mhm.
so that would be a great idea. Actually, thank you
Oh,
for that. Yes, and happy Moon Festival for you and for your family.
it's like the Thanksgiving, people get together under full moon to celebrate the
Mm,
families and harvest and stuff like that. Yeah. So
mm,
it's a very important festival in China.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay,
Oh,
then why
absolutely. Yes.
yeah, why don't you tell me, what you talked I'm very curious about what you and Professor Sachs talked about.
Well, right. We talked about the general international situation. We talked about the BRICS. You'll see the program that's coming out probably tomorrow between
Okay.
myself. It's Glenn Deason was also involved. But before we did the program, I had a brief discussion with him about the discussion that he had with Professor Mearsheimer,
Hmm.
which has appeared. I forget the name of the YouTube channel, but you know which it is.
Yeah.
And Professor Mearsheimer spoke about how China is the peer competitor and rival of the United States. And in a world where there is chaos and instability and all of the rest, the United States must be tough and ruthless and basically put China in its place
Mhm.
and keep the Chinese down, because that's the only way that the US can ensure its own security, which because otherwise, inevitably and inexorably, China will threaten it. And I completely disagree with that view. I think this is wholly wrong. I've said
Mhm.
this many times. I think that Professor Mearsheimer, who is one of the greatest scholars on international relations in the West, is deriving his ideas very much from the European system, where indeed you did have various states in constant rivalry and war with each other, and
Mhm.
where war was an absolute structural element and interstate competition was an absolute structural element of European society, culminating, of course, eventually in the two world wars. I don't think this is true of the global
Mhm.
situation, and I absolutely do not think this is true of how China conducts its foreign relations, has ever conducted its foreign relations. I
Mhm.
think it is based on a misreading of Chinese history, which has always generally sought peace with its neighbors. When China has indeed expanded its territory, its territorial control, it has been in the direction of inner Asia, Central Asia, as we would call it today. And that has almost invariably been in a defensive way. It is to
Mhm.
protect China from the Central Asian nomadic peoples, the people that I never know how to pronounce their names, the Juchen and the Xiongnu. The
The
Chinese
Shinu,
obviously know how to pronounce these words,
uh-huh.
and all of these people, the Mongols, of course, all of those. And China has needed sometimes to extend its control into these regions in order to prevent these people from pressing against China. China has never shown any desire or intent to expand into the Pacific, even though it's had various opportunities to, or at least what the West would call opportunities to. It had massive naval dominance in the Pacific in the 15th century when it had the treasure fleets, and it made no attempt to do that then. It had very good trading and diplomatic relations with the nations of Eastern Asia, which the West completely misunderstands. It refers to something called the tributary system, which never existed. It was a system of mutual trade and mutual understanding and mutual diplomacy that worked extremely well for many, many centuries. That the whole structure of Chinese society is based on concepts of stability and harmony. Harmony is a big is
Mhm.
a big word in China, which is not, I
Yeah.
think, properly understood in the West at all. But last but not least, and a point I specifically made to Jeffrey Sachs, that if the United States were to do that which Professor Mearsheimer was talking about in that program, which is to take on China in the East Asian region, on the first and second and all that island chains and all
Island
of
chain,
that,
yeah.
it would lose.
Yeah.
It will lose. I mean, anybody who knows anything about the geopolitical realities of that region, the relative balance of economic and military power, and by the way, the culture and history of the societies that are there. And I should tell you, I've been to South Korea, I've been to Malaysia. I am, by the way, traveling to Malaysia next week. I will be in Malaysia over the course of next week. If you go to these places, you will see how profound the interconnections with China are, and the fact that the people in these places, and that includes, by the way, South Korea, do not want to get into a long-term adversarial relationship with China. If the United States gets drawn in, tries to draw these societies into a long-term adversarial relationship with China, with the possible exception of Japan, it will meet resistance over time there. So all of the facts say that eventually in the United States gets involved in a long-term confrontation in this region with China, it will lose. So this confrontation is neither necessary, because I completely agree with Professor Sachs. China poses no threat to the United States and has never posed any threat to the United States at any period in its history, and certainly doesn't do so today. And secondly, doing what Professor Mearsheimer proposes would be construed by the Chinese as a threat to themselves. They would inevitably then take counter action, which would mean that the United States would lose. And if you want proof of that, look at the two East Asian wars that the United States has fought, which are wars, in effect. Well, the Chinese were on the other side. One was Korea and one was Vietnam. China in the 1950s, when the Korean War was fought, was not the China of today. Far less powerful, much poorer country, and yet it fought the United States to a standstill in Korea. And about Vietnam, we all know what the outcome there was. So, I mean, this is completely wrong. As I said, it's based on a misapplication of European history to the completely different world of East Asia. And it does not take into account the actual relative balance between China and the United States. So that's it.
I think, yeah, but I have to say, he actually represents a group of people. It's not just him. They are people who are, seems like have their mind very clear about what's going on in Ukraine is not a winnable war. They want to see it end, but they don't seem to have problem containing. They use the word containing China. He represents a group of people, even like the panels, like David Sachs, I think it's like that. I read his article, he's like that. And then the other two panelists, I don't know who they are. In the United States, I find that they tend to invite like a rich people. I just assume they're rich and fancy people because they're rich, then they must, know everything. So, but I think that they all have that kind of view. Jeffrey Sachs probably is the only one on the panel that you would agree, I think.
Well, they're all the press applauding Professor Mearsheimer, and when Sachs spoke, he was listened to in bewildered silence. I completely agree. There is something about China that seems to warp the minds of some people in the United States. That's all I can say. I get to say it. I get to be. I should say I know David Sachs. I like him very much. I think that on Ukraine he's entirely sensible and very sane, and on many other topics as well. On China, as you rightly say, like Professor Mearsheimer, whom I also know and like, I think all of these people have a blind spot, a dangerous one. But, and with apologies to these people, I think fundamentally, deep down, the core thing is that they can't get their heads around the fact that a non-European society, an East Asian society, has surpassed in many respects the mighty, invincible United States, which all Americans believe somehow represents the peak of European and therefore, by definition, human civilization. And I think this is really ultimately the problem, because anybody who has any knowledge of China, any knowledge of Chinese history, any knowledge of the true sentiments of the Chinese people will know that what they're fighting is ghosts. They have no substance. They have invented a China of their minds, which has no real connection to the China that actually exists.
Yeah, and if you want to learn, the China mentality, just look at the wall, the Great Wall, right?
Yeah,
China built the wall to protect itself,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
If you're aggressive, you would be just keep on going out and exploring and occupying and colonizing. You wouldn't be put so much effort onto building such a great wall, right? I think that by itself should tell you something about the mentality there. Um,
Absolutely. This is completely correct. A society, a Chinese society that has the resources to build a structure like the Great Wall
well, yeah,
at the time, when the Great Wall was built, well, of course, it was built at various times, but it was
yeah,
what we mainly see today is built
yeah,
during the Ming Dynasty,
dynasty,
and that was, let's talk about that time, the 16th
yeah,
century. A society that has those kind of resources has the resources to conduct massive expansion
yeah,
and aggression everywhere in the world. And China chose not to do that. In
yeah.
fact, if you read the discussions and debates that took place, and we have the records about the discussions in the 16th century during the Ming dynasty. We have it, because Chinese records are incredible. We could see that the idea of launching some
Yeah,
great, war of conquest never occurred to
yeah,
anybody. It was never even discussed. The
no,
thought never even existed. So that's why they went. I mean, they were having these problems with the Mongols. It was mainly about
mhm,
the Mongols at that time.
yeah,
There was a big battle in the middle in the later part of the 15th century, when the Mongols managed to capture the emperor, who was a fool and
mhm,
left the capital and tried to
yeah,
lead an army against the Mongols and all of that. And they had lots of problems afterwards. And they made a decision: look, how are we going to protect ourselves? We are going to build the Great Wall. And that's what
well,
they did. And
mhm,
that reflects the aspirations, the feeling of Chinese society. Chinese society is very, very pacific. The Chinese will fight and defend themselves and defend their interests. But as I repeatedly said so many times in these programs, if you look at their art, which is the strongest reflection of a society, you notice how committed to harmony and peace and balance China Chinese society is. You see this in their architecture, in their gardens.
mhm.
You see it in their paintings, which, as I
Paintings,
said,
yeah,
are,
mhm,
are my particular love. Never see any depictions of war in them and conquest and
yeah,
that kind of thing. You never see it.
yeah. If there's any comfort, I don't know if you read that under that YouTube, there were lots of comments. Actually, I would say overwhelmingly people like Jeffrey Sachs. So
Yeah,
the audience outside that
yeah,
that
the
forum,
bubble.
whatever that is, yeah.
Yeah, that
So
bubble
I
of
think,
people. Yeah.
yeah, I think most people still like peace. They like
Yes.
Jeffrey Sachs' idea of make
Yes.
peace with China.
Yeah.
I think majority, even Americans, I think probably British too, don't see China as a threat.
Yeah.
I really
Yeah.
don't think regular people,
Well, I,
yeah.
I don't know about America so well, but about Britain, I can say that unequivocally. It's a very striking fact, by the way, just to say, and this is something that people in China might find interesting. Whenever people in Britain go on and on about immigrants, and they always do, by the way. I mean, this is constantly talked about. It's very, very striking, but they never ever talk about, or are angry about Chinese immigrants. China is popular with the British people. the British people, what they know about China, they very much like. It may be their own interpretations of Chinese food, which may not be very similar to what you eat in China, but whatever it is about China, to the extent that the British have any conception or knowledge of China, they like it. They certainly don't have any interest in a war with it.
Yeah, the overseas Chinese are like that too. They kind of like keep for
Mm,
themselves and doing their business, doing their things, and not very aggressive people in
no,
general.
no.
Yeah. And I would say sometimes to the Chinese detriment is that we don't even that interested in politics. Most Chinese in particular, it's grown up in mainland and then you immigrate to another country. All we want, and our parents, like when I left China, my parents are telling me, be a good student and do your, work hard and those kind of things. They don't intend to even interfere with the politics, to tangle themselves into politics, even though it's in fact important. If you want to have some voices and representations, you actually do need to, stand up and to be a politician. But it's just like, okay, let them do their thing, let me do my thing. It's a very
Yes.
kind of like not not that harmful people, so. Yeah.
As you discover when you go there. By the way, again, can I just say you can read 18th century accounts of visitors, Western visitors to China at that time, the 18th century. And I mean, specifically English ones, the Macartney mission, for example, which we've talked about, touched on
Yeah.
in other programs, but other earlier visits to China as well. And one of the things that impressed Westerners about China at that time is how peaceful and law-abiding and orderly it was. It certainly compared with the Europe of that time. And I think that partly reflects what you've just said. Most Chinese people are hardworking. They have very strong traditions of hard work, of honesty. But you could say that it comes from what the West calls Confucianism, if you like. I don't know whether that's true or not.
Yeah.
But anyway, it's all there. And I think it continues to this day.
Yeah. But I guess we just have to, I just wish that people like Mearsheimer, David Sachs, even Tucker Carlson, I think I want them to go visit China, go spend some time there. And um anyway,
There
it's
we
a
go.
very, yeah. All right. Okay. The Middle East, like yesterday, right? This exploding pager thing in Lebanon. What is your, let me first just share with you the Chinese netizens' reaction to it. So there are plenty of people saying, oh, now we know why the US keep on talking about, okay, the Chinese phones, the Huawei phones, or the Chinese EVs, and everything China produces is dangerous, it's national security risks. Now we know why, because that's what the United States is doing. They have that capability, and they're planning to do it, and they are afraid that we would do it, because even though we never thought of doing something like that, but the United States knows that, and that's why they take, because they want to do it, they can do it, they afraid that China would do it. So that's, lots of people commenting about that. And then of course with that, then people are saying, well, maybe we should buy Huawei now instead of buying an Apple phone. Apple phone is still very popular in China, etc. So what is your take on that, the whole thing?
That is not a bad point, actually. I mean, it wasn't, I have to say, what immediately came to my mind when I heard about the story. I mean, what came to my mind about this is, again, the incredible violence and belligerence of the Israeli authorities, who are clearly behind this, and of the Western powers that back them. I mean, this is a mass assassination attempt using pages, some of which are going to be handled by children, as they were, with some children killed. And you can see that this out of control, incredibly dangerous, very violent Israeli government is preparing for a general war in the Middle East. We've been saying this on these programs. I've been saying this on these programs for some time, and that's another stage in that. But I think on that other point that the netizens are making, I think they're absolutely right. Not specifically about this issue, but generally, which is that the West doesn't like these technologies to pass outside its control because it uses them as tools for control and dominance, and as we see now, violence. I mean, and I think that is true. It wants every smartphone to be American. It wants every pager to be American. It wants all of these things to be American. It wants the software and the, so that they can monitor what the discussions are. They want to be able to break whatever encryption there is. They want to be able to use that for surveillance as well, so that if people open their phones or have their phones next to them, as I do, they can listen into what people are saying. And they want all of that. And of course, here come the Chinese with their own technologies and their own systems, which are not as adaptable as the Western ones are to what the Americans want. And the Americans don't like it at all. And with the pager incident, we see an extreme example of this, or so it seems to me.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It is. I mean, when I read it, I was really shocked. I used to work at a Swedish company, Ericsson. So I work in the telecom industry, and my husband is also, his areas in the networking. So, I mean, to use the technology, use the electronics this way is utterly despicable. I mean, it's just beyond what regular people's comprehension, I would say, that they would just do it.
Well, absolutely. And, if it was done by someone else, the West would be saying this.
Yeah.
I mean, if the Russians, for example, found a means of blowing up the mobile phones or pages used by Ukrainian exiles in Europe, I mean, you can imagine what people would say. Or if this was done by Iran or someone like that, because it's Israel, which is one of us, we really don't care. On the contrary, in fact, there are some people. I mean, I was reading some articles today in parts of the British and American media, people like Jim Garrity and Hamish de Bretton Gordon, who's a British military officer, and they are in ecstasies about this, that the fact that the Israelis have been able to do this brilliant thing. I read an article in the American media, in the National Review, which said, that Israeli intelligence is awesome. They're able to carry out indiscriminate murder in this fashion. That's awesome.
But it does not serve the interest of Israel, because now people will not buy anything coming out of Israel. I mean, why would anybody? Not only that, even the products from US will be affected, because the fact that the US doesn't seem to take this very seriously. Oh, we're not aware of that, but there's no condemnation or anything. I mean, does it really serve the best interest of Israel and even the US?
No, of course it doesn't. I mean, you're absolutely correct. I mean, in times of peace, for a state to do such a thing, first of all, it's an act of terrorism. It is.
Yes,
and a state that does a thing like this is engaging in terrorism. It is. And people around the world who want to go about living their lives and who want to be able to trust that the phone that they use isn't going to kill them, they're not going to want to buy these phones. I mean, it's not difficult to think this through. But of course, in the West, we never think things through. We continue to do this. And of course, when people want, in that case, to buy Chinese phones, our response is to launch media campaigns and legal campaigns against the Chinese companies that make those phones, and then to try to ban the phones. That's what we do now.
Yeah, and this happened apparently one day earlier. Biden sent somebody from the State Department, Amos Hochstein, I think that's his name, and his mission was to talk to the Israeli Defense Minister Gallant, right, and to talk to him and trying to figure out a way to de-escalate the conflict with Hezbollah. And then this happened, like the very next day, and of course Blinken is on his way to the Middle East too. So it's always like they're trying to de-escalate, but then things get escalated, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly correct. I mean, it's so straight. And of course, it's quite obvious that Israel, or at least the Israeli government, is constantly putting up its fingers, as we say in Britain, to the United States, to the Biden administration. They tell the Americans come along and tell them, please don't do this. This isn't very good. We don't want escalation. We don't want a general war. Netanyahu and his people, who clearly do want a general war, then just go ahead and do whatever it is that they can do to escalate the situation further. They humiliate the Americans, or at least they humiliate the administration. And the administration just comes back and says, it's the fault of Iran. It's the fault of Hezbollah. It's not Israel's fault. We will defend Israel no matter what. And it's so bizarre. It's Stockholm syndrome. This business where the hostage adopts the thinking of its captor, because that's what it's become. That's what it amounts to now.
So what's next then? Because also not a few days ago, the Houthis also fired 2 hypersonic missiles.
Yeah,
China reported it's 2. Now the West, I think Israel admitted 1, but apparently
yeah,
there's 2. The second one they don't even notice that
yeah.
they couldn't intercept the first one. The second one they didn't even notice apparently. So I think that also have something, I don't know how the Israel is going to respond. Israel said they are going to respond. So what's next in the Middle East now?
Well, sooner or later, one way or the other, either tomorrow or next week or in a month's time or in 3 months or in 6 months, we are going to get a war in the Middle East, a big war in the Middle East, because one side, which is Israel, wants it. I mean, when I say Israel, I again should stress the Israeli government. A lot of Israelis do not want it, but the Israeli government, Prime Minister Netanyahu, they made it quite clear they want it. They want a war against Hezbollah. And beyond that, ultimately, they want a war against Iran.
Yeah.
And you can see that the other side is now taking its own steps. So someone, probably the Iranians, provided the Houthis with this capability, this hypersonic capability. The Houthis used these missiles against Israel. And I think that was intended more as a warning again, that we have this capability. If you go after, you could be attacked from multiple directions. You're not just up against Iran. Shoigu, who is the secretary of Russia's Security Council, has just gone to Iran. Putin met with the Iranian National Security Advisor in Moscow last week. He also, by the way, met with Wang Yi, and he also met the National Security Advisor of India, Ajit Doval. But those people you would expect to meet, he also went out of his way to meet the National Security Advisor of Iran. So you can see that all the battle lines are being drawn, and we are heading towards a war in the Middle East. And to say it again, it's only happening because one group of people, the Israeli cabinet, the hardliners in the Israeli cabinet, want it. They both see the opportunity to advance their project of building, as they say, Israel in the land of Israel, setting up the temple, doing all of those things in Jerusalem and driving the Palestinians out of Gaza and all of that. And at the same time, they see the danger that if they don't do that, then the entire Israel project will start to reverse as they see it. Israel might be forced into a shameful peace as they see it. And it cannot afford the kind of long war which it finds itself in now. So it's a very, very dangerous situation. And I don't see anybody in the West making any effort to really dial it down or to pull it back. To the extent that they're calling for restraint, it's always against the wrong parties. It's always these calls to restraint are always addressed to the wrong parties.
Yeah. Then why do you think the United States so afraid? It seems like so afraid of Israel. I mean, Israel is such a small country. Is it all because of the AIPAC, or is there some other reason that they must protect Israel at all cost? I don't quite get it.
I don't think it is just about APAC.
Right.
I
Yeah.
think that in many people's, I think APAC has grown to absolutely huge dimensions in many people's imagination. I'm not denying that it has its influence and that these other parts of the Israel lobby don't have their influence. But fundamentally, this goes back a long way to the Cold War, when the United States found itself, as it believed, in a duel with the Soviet Union for influence in the Middle East, and Israel was its advanced base and fortress in the Middle East. And at that time, very, very deep connections were forged between the Israeli and American military-industrial complex, the American and Israeli militaries, the foreign policy establishment, the general security establishment, the intelligence establishment. So these two have become so closely enmeshed and intertwined with each other that the deep state in the United States, if I could call it that, has come to think of Israel as basically an extension of the United States in the Middle East. And I think that is the ultimate problem.
Now, in the Chinese netizens, their analysis is that the U.S. needs Israel to be in the Middle East, basically to stir trouble, so that all the other Middle East countries are afraid. Then they will need the U.S. to protect them somehow.
I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot of truth in that. By the way, carry on.
And the same thing with they like Russia to be aggressive. They want to portray Russia as an aggressive country, so that all the other Europeans will be lined up. Is that some truth to it?
No, I think if we go to the Middle East, if we go straight back to the question of the Middle East, the big movement in the Middle East before the Arab-Israeli crisis began, basically in the 1950s, late 40s, 1950s, the big movement, political movement in the Middle East at that time was anti-imperialist, anti-colonialist, and nationalist. It was all about the unification of the Arabs, bringing together all the Arab peoples, maybe into one state or into one community. And that was what Nasser in Egypt was all about. And he wasn't the only one. And that was seen by the United States as an enormous potential threat, because Arab unity could pose a danger to the United States, to Western dominance in the Middle East. It was very important for strategic reasons and also for economic reasons, because, of course, this is the major producer, a major producer of oil, and it's also a place where vast sums of dollars and currency get moved about. So the United States needed to maintain control of the Middle East. So having this very powerful country, Israel, there, which, as you correctly said, as the netizens correctly said, keeps everything tense and unstable, enables the US to exert influence right across the region. It enables the US to play on everybody and, say that we're there to protect you, we're there to defend you, we're there to find all kinds of means to control you, basically. And to be frank, it has worked quite well. I mean, most of if you look at the situation in the Middle East in the 1970s, for example, Soviet influence in the Middle East at that point completely collapsed. This is, 15 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. Soviet influence in the Middle East collapsed because everybody wanted to talk to the Americans, because they were seen as the key to security in the region. Now I think it's turning into a problem because the Israeli client is slipping out of control.
Yeah, it almost always happens. When they groom somebody, right, for a purpose, but sooner or later somehow you will lose control. If either this thing doesn't work, okay, it disappeared, or it will grow, and then you lose control over it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly. But the United States keep on doing these kind of things, keep on making these kind of mistakes.
They are compulsive about this. They risk, I mean, to say it frankly, they risk getting into the same crisis with Japan. Very much more powerful country. But they're feeding revanchist sentiments in Japan, which could you could see how easily those could get out of control. And that would be very, very dangerous and problematic for the United States. But the US never, ever learns the lesson. It does this all the time.
Yeah, if you look at the like Chiang Kai-shek, okay, I read some time ago that U.S. actually was seriously considering to assassinate him because
Mm,
they couldn't control him,
mm,
even though they are the one who beefed him up, right, to put him into where he was. And the same thing happened in Vietnam, right,
mm.
etc. They just like every time they have their client, I mean, whoever, the proxy there, but then eventually they somehow lose control over it. It just seems
Well,
so interesting.
this is exactly what happened in Vietnam. I mean, the
Yeah.
leader of South Vietnam, a man called Diem,
Hmm.
completely escaped American control, and the Americans decided to overthrow him and
Hmm.
organized a coup. And
Hmm.
the then U.S. President John Kennedy gave an interview on American television, in which he gave the green light for the coup. It's quite extraordinary to watch this interview, and you see him quite brazenly giving the green light for the coup. And over the course of the coup, Diem was assassinated by the South Vietnamese generals, which, by the way, was not what the Americans had wanted, but they lost control of the process, just as they'd
Yeah.
previously lost control of Diem. And well, it was a complete mess. And again, they didn't learn the lesson. What did they do? They doubled down. They always do that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, the Chiang Kai-shek thing is also, I was surprised
Yeah.
because
I
he,
didn't know about Chiang Kai-shek, by the way. I mean, that
well, he,
doesn't surprise me, but because
yeah,
who they are. But
well,
anyway, carry
I'm
on.
very interested in that because my grandfather used to working under him, under Chiang
All
Kai-shek.
right. All
Yeah.
right.
So,
Yeah.
but anyway, so they just simply think with he and in particular his wife had a really good relationship with the U.S. I mean, extremely
Oh yeah.
corrupt people, but but nonetheless, really good relationship.
I can remember what was her name, Sung, whatever. She was one of
So
the
so
three.
Mei Ling,
Yeah, she was one
Madam,
of the three sisters, wasn't she? I
yes,
mean, she
so Mei
was.
Ling, yeah, Mei Ling, yeah,
But I can remember what a revered figure she was
yeah, oh
in
yeah,
the West, and
yeah,
how we always used to hear about Madame Chiang Kai-shek, what
yeah,
a
yeah.
tremendous person she was. It was only afterwards that we learned how utterly corrupt she also was. But anyway, but she was much more. She was at that time more the face of the Kuomintang
Hmm.
regime in Taiwan that had escaped to Taiwan, even than Chiang Kai-shek himself was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but anyway, so I always thought that they had a really close relationship
Yeah.
with the U.S. But even without within the U.S. Administrations, they were people absolutely couldn't stand them because they're
Mhm.
so corrupt. But then in
Mm.
the end, I think they decided they were seriously thinking to replace him with
Mm.
somebody else, and he insisted he's not leaving, he's not going to give in or whatever. So they were thinking to assassinate him. Apparently,
Mm.
that was seriously considered. So
Good grief. Good grief.
just, just so you know.
No, there you go. I mean, I knew nothing about it. I mean, it's certainly not, as I said, the image of them that was being presented to us at the
Mhm.
time.
Yeah, but it's not surprising. I mean, it's think about it. It's actually not that
No,
surprising. They lost control
no,
of him also.
no,
Yeah. So
no.
and also, speaking of all these weapons, the long range missiles that the Storm Shadow and then the ATACMS, I actually thought that they would allow, they would give a green light to Ukraine. So it's a little bit surprised to me that in the end, they, at least for now, okay, we cannot say for
Yeah,
sure, but at least for now, they're not doing
yeah.
that. Well, is it because they're afraid of a series of warning coming from Putin himself? Is that what happened?
I think that has played an enormous role. I mean, Putin
Okay.
talked about a state of war if this
Yeah.
was done, and the reason he gave, which by the way the media in the West has not reported, is that these weapons can only be used with the direct involvement of Western technicians, military personnel, uploading data by hand
Hmm.
onto the software that's used with these, the guidance software. And he
Hmm.
made the point, if you do that, then your own people are participating in direct missile strikes against our country, and that is an act of war, and we will treat it as one. And in the past, the Russians have made clear that if this were to happen, they would reciprocate. They
Hmm.
haven't made it clear how they would reciprocate, but they did tell the British some months ago that if the British missiles were used against Russia, then the Russians would consider any British military facility anywhere in the world a potential target. Just to say, so this is incredibly dangerous, and I think the Pentagon is taking this warning very seriously indeed. But beyond that, I think the Pentagon is saying, look, what is this supposed to achieve?
Mhm.
These missiles are very few in number. They have relatively short range. The Russian aircraft and facilities are outside the range of these missiles. We're going to run enormous risks, and there are no gains. So, what is this? What is the point of this? And I think that what happened is that the Pentagon put his foot down and said no.
Mhm.
And some people in Washington went along with that. A lot of others have not. I mean,
Mhm.
Blinken, who's the Secretary of State, apparently still keen on this idea and
Yeah.
is telling the British to just keep lobbying for it. And, well, he might eventually prevail. So I wouldn't write this possibility off.
Uh-huh.
But I
Yeah.
think that there are reasons why the Pentagon said no.
Apparently, in the Chinese media, saying that the Russian ambassador in Washington to the United States, apparently he got quite a few phone calls from some retired diplomats, ask him how serious Putin is, how serious Russia
Mm.
is, with his words. And the Chinese media is saying, okay, those diplomats must be sent by Biden to truly get a feeling how serious this is. So I guess his message to them is, don't play with fire, something like that, I guess. So that probably played a role. Yeah.
I'm sure it did actually. Now that's very,
Yeah.
very interesting because I'm sure this story is true. It
Mhm.
makes complete sense. It's not been reported in the Russian media.
Yeah. Okay.
I no, I think that I don't doubt the story. By the way, it's
Mhm.
completely logical. But I think what has happened is that it's a further sign that the Russians are briefing the Chinese very closely about what is happening. So I think that's an interesting story, and I didn't know about this. And thanks. Mm.
The other thing also interesting, you probably find interesting, is apparently during the meeting, Biden with Starmer, Biden was saying, okay, if you want to go ahead with Storm Shadow, we support that, but we will hold on to our own attackums, something like
Yeah,
that. And then Starmer was like taken back a little bit, like, okay, that's
yeah,
not what I planned. It's not something we would
yeah,
want to do alone, at least not
yeah.
now. What do you take on that? I think that's probably true also.
Yes, it probably is. Only one must be a
Yeah.
bit careful because it could be that this is a story that the British
Okay.
are floating. That well, we're telling the Americans, well, if you don't want to do it, don't worry, but we'll just do it. And obviously, we need because it appears, and this is what the British media was saying, that because the guidance data, has to come from American satellites, and in order to upload it you have to use American proprietary software. American technicians would have to be involved. So the British might have been trying to sneak the Americans into this by coming up with this idea. But what is indisputable, and it is all over the British media here, is that the British were shocked by the American reaction. They were expecting that they would come out of that meeting in Washington with some sort of agreement from the Americans. Blinken apparently basically told them that the Americans would say yes. And the Foreign Office, the British Foreign Ministry, was much more skeptical and advised by Starmer, look, this isn't a good idea. The Americans don't really want to go here. Pull back, draw back. And apparently he ignored their advice. This is in the British media, by the way. The
Okay.
Times did a big
Uh-huh.
article about this. And when the British came and they found the Americans saying no, they were absolutely shocked. And there's been an enormous amount of recrimination about this in London. So, and if you see the pictures and the film of the meeting, the
Mhm.
before the delegation started, what struck me is that the Americans were absolutely stony faced. I mean, they didn't look at all pleased. Biden was looked clearly angry and frankly rude. Mind you, he's often looks angry and rude. But the
Yeah.
other
Yeah.
members of the delegation, the American delegation, really didn't seem at all happy. That was absolutely my impression.
And okay, the same question, what was next? Because Putin also orders the military to boost the troops now to
Yeah.
1.5 million. That's a lot.
Yes, it's an awful
So
lot.
so it just seems like that is also getting more and more tense, even though for now, at least, they're not going to allow the
Yeah.
Ukrainians to use those long-range missiles to get into Russian territory. But like you said, it's not the end of the story, right? So what do you
No.
think is going to happen there?
Right. Well, I mean, the decree from Putin increasing the size of the Russian army is, in fact, to some extent, looking backwards, in the sense that what happened was that the Russian government began a major recruiting drive to increase the size of the Russian army in January 2023, and it's been continuing steadily at a rate of about 1,000 men a day since then. And that has now brought the Russian army to roughly the level that this new decree says. So he signed off on this decree, to recognizing that this is the size of the Russian army at the moment. My understanding is that the intention is to continue the recruitment process until the end of this year, and then it will stop. And it's principally intended to build up forces in order to finish the war in Ukraine. The Russians want somewhere around 800,000 to 1 million men, as they see it, to complete the war in Ukraine. By the end of this year, they will have it. Then the war will be brought to an end. And then I suspect that the Russians will decide to start scaling their army down, because this is a very, very large military, 2.5 million men altogether, for 1.5 million in the actual army, 2.5 million if you add all the Air Force, the Navy, all of the other things. It's a very, very large military establishment for a country of 150 million people. So I think Putin will want a lot of those men to go back into civilian life, rejoin the economy, start manning the factories where there's labor shortages. And I think for that reason, I think this is conceived of as a temporary thing, actually. But it does tell us a lot about what the Russians are intending to do. And I think that it indicates that the Russians are now very, very serious about winning the war in Ukraine, that they're going to go all in. They're winning on the battlefronts now, but they're preparing for the big hammer blow that is going to fall at some point in the next 6 months.
Yeah, and then the question is, if they are, if the Ukrainians really cannot last, because I guess the US wanted it to last at least until November, right? But
Yeah.
what if they they can't, and then like you said, maybe they will eventually will allow the long range missiles. My question is this: I mean, what does is that going to make any difference? We've been here before. There's all kinds of the so-called wonder weapons, right? The Leopard 2 tank, the Patriot air defense system, the HIMARS. I mean, there are plenty of those kind of wonder weapons, but in the end, none of them are really game changing. They only prolong the war, right? Do you think the long range missile will make any difference?
Every single military official analyst who's looked at this has said that they won't. And I mean, that begs the question of why, in that case, do this incredibly reckless and dangerous thing if it's not going to succeed. Every single Western weapon system that's been supplied to Ukraine has failed to achieve the objective that people expected it would achieve. If we're talking about the Storm Shadows and the ATACMS, they've already been used many times in Ukraine. They haven't succeeded in isolating Crimea, destroying the Russian Black Sea Fleet, destroying the bridge between Crimea and the rest of Russia. They've achieved none of the objectives that people said. Most of them are regularly shot down by the Russian air defenses. And I see no reason to think that just a couple of hundred at most, probably less than 100 actually, missiles launched against Russia are going to make any difference in terms of the military campaign at all. The fact is that we are in the end game, and I think this is a thing to say. I mean, the economic situation in Ukraine is now critical. There are fears again of hyperinflation. The IMF is drawing back. The military situation is disastrous and getting worse. An important Ukrainian town called Ukrainsk was captured by the Russians yesterday. Another one is about to fall. I mean, things are going very, very badly wrong. The Russian army is getting bigger and stronger all of the time. And the result is, and this is what is driving all of these very dangerous plans, we see that the Western powers are looking for some sort of key that is going to solve this problem for them without they themselves having to make concessions to the Russians, which they don't want to make. So we have storm shadows and ATACMS missiles used in deep strikes against Russia, which apparently or supposedly are going to scare the Russians into making concessions. We have talk about looking for a diplomatic off-ramp, but when you analyze it, they're not proposing anything serious. Of course, we can't talk to the Chinese because if we do, that would be, well, that would be, giving the other superpower, the China of all countries, the enemy, a voice in this matter. So we're trying with the Indians instead. The Indians don't seem too keen at the moment. Anyway, there we go. So all of this is going on. But I'm going to say something else. This is also a dangerous situation for the Russians because they are on the brink of a military victory. What no one is clear about is what their plans are once that victory is won. And this is an area where I think we are probably going to see the Russians eventually turning to the Chinese, not for military assistance and that kind of thing, but to discuss with China what they're going to do once they've won the war, what they're going to do with Ukraine. Because I'm not sure that the Russians themselves know. And I think they will need to talk about this with their friends, first and foremost, their friends in Beijing, but also in Delhi and in other places.
Yeah. Yeah, we will see. I mean, yeah, I agree. I think it is, where we are going, heading into the end of the game, but it is when it's very dangerous. Yeah, because there will be desperate moves that, yeah. Speaking of which, about China, I want to share with you. So remember in June, Lloyd Austin visited China. And at the time, there is not a whole lot we can read from the media, but apparently these are the things he asked China to do. He said he asked China to do three things: stop developing advanced weapons, stop working with Russia, and then cut the PLO, the People's Liberation Army forces, in half. These are the three things China needs to do, yeah, in order for the US to stop suppressing China. So when I was reading it, and in lots of people put comments in there, that the netizens. One of them said, "Why don't we just stop breathing?"
Yeah. I think that Lloyd Austin needs a cold shower. To be frank, I mean, this is one of the most preposterous things I have ever heard in my life. It doesn't surprise me, by the way. It's exactly the kind of lunacies that the Americans would come up with. All right, I mean, put pressure on the Russians. You could just about understand why they would want to do that. But the others, half the size of the People's Liberation Army, stop developing advanced weapons. I mean, again, do they know recent Chinese history? Do they know anything about the unequal treaties and what the Chinese people feel about those? Do they seriously believe that the current government in China, having brought China to the level that it has achieved now, is ever going to agree to even a fraction of this? I mean, it's not stupid. I mean, there is no word to describe it. Somewhere beyond beyond stupid. I mean, if stupidity, if some kind of stupidity beyond mere stupidity exists, well, that is it.
Yeah. I think it goes back a little bit like because Mearsheimer also talked about, okay, China has been increased its capability. Like he particularly focused on the Blue River Navy, Blue Navy something. I guess the Blue Navy means the strong Navy or something. I don't quite got it, but anyway, and when he was talking about that, that's exactly what I was thinking. Like, do you know why China need a blue navy? Do you know the Opium War, right? That's where China learned its lesson, okay, to this day. And the same thing, just like you said with Austin, that before he opened his mouth asking things like that, he really should do some research and learn something, right? And that's why this thing, this is a retired general. You see, in the Chinese media, sometimes I think the Chinese government will leak something to these people, retired people, and something they would talk about it, because I don't read it in the official report about this. But he was the one who talked about that this is the Austin's requirement for the US to stop suppressing China. And he was saying, how can we possibly, agree to something like that? And of course, all the comments agree with him. But, I guess we just simply have to accept the fact that the United States, people like Lloyd Austin, just simply are not interested in learning about China, learning about China's needs. I guess that's
or taking China seriously, because of course what's going to happen, what is going to happen is when the Chinese are presented with this set of demands by Lloyd Austin, they're going to go away and tell themselves we've got to do the opposite of what he says, because this is so obviously threatening. I mean, it is. I mean, this bears the hallmarks of an ultimatum about it. It has the quality of a threat to China, and China knows that it must respond to threats. That's the history of the last 200 years. So the Chinese will do the opposite of what he demands. They're going to increase the size of their own armed forces. They're going to develop the technology of their armed forces further. They're going to build up their blue water navy, and they're going to strengthen their links with their friends, one of whom is, of course, Russia. I mean, it is inevitable. This is so, as I said, it is so stupid. I have to say, I've always got the impression that Lloyd Austin was not, as we say in Britain, the sharpest knife in the drawer. In other words, he's not the cleverest man that you could possibly find. But I've no doubt that he does represent the general feeling of many people in the US. And, China, the world's biggest trader of manufactured goods, the country with the world's by far the biggest merchant fleet. It's got shipping that goes around the world. It is a Pacific power. The Pacific is the world's biggest ocean, and it's not allowed to have a navy. I mean, it's just absurd.
Yeah, and exactly. I mean, they were going back to this conversation between Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs. One of the panelists, one of those fancy people were talking about, okay, we need free navigation or something like that. And my question is, why would China do not want free navigation, right? I mean, China is the largest trading partner with the 140 countries. It serves China's best interest to have a free navigation. But somehow these people just assume, free navigation means the United States can do whatever it wants, but not everybody else, right?
Well, that's exactly correct. The country that has the greatest interest in free navigation is the country that trades the most, which is China. Obviously, they are the world's biggest exporter. They are one of the biggest importers. They need free navigation. They're not the people who've been threatening to close the Straits of Malacca and, establish positions on the. I can never remember. Was it the first island chain or the second island chain? So obviously not. Of course they need free navigation. The people who really, actually, truly do not believe in free navigation are the Americans. They're the only people who've been talking about naval blockades recently. Just saying.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Okay. Um, the Trump assassination, we almost forgot that. I mean,
No.
it's pretty incredible. This is the second time now.
Mm.
Now, Trump's own he says that he believes that Biden and Harris are rhetoric to blame for the assassination attempt. Do you agree?
Yes,
Yeah,
in a simple word, of course I do. Not
yeah,
just Biden and Harris, everyone
uh-huh,
else, all of these
yeah,
other Democrats. Notice, by the way, that already there, I mean, one was almost tempted to say, what Trump assassination? I mean, the
yes,
media, about, half an hour of attention, a few articles about this guy wrote saying, what a nutcase he is, which he probably is,
uh-huh,
by the way. But the rhetoric about Trump, which is unrelenting, is incendiary and is almost inevitably going to result in attacks of this kind. Let me repeat again. I think I said this before in our previous programs when the first assassination took place. When I used to work in the Royal Courts of Justice in London, one of the most difficult parts of my job was to go into the police cells which exist under the Royal Courts of Justice and find all kinds of individuals, psychopaths,
mhm,
murderers, people of incredible levels of violence, um, incredibly angry, incredibly dangerous, and try and find lawyers who would represent them because lawyers didn't want to represent them, which is unsurprising. And I used to meet these people. And what I found is that these individuals, more often than not, what drives them is extreme levels of anger,
mhm,
except often they're not clear what they are angry about. So if you spread stories about someone, if you go on and on and on and on and talk about them and say that he's a tyrant, a threat to democracy, a person who's going to, do the most terrible things, you are giving people like that an excuse and a focus for that anger which they
mhm,
already feel.
mhm,
And that will attract them like a magnet, and only a small percentage will go all the way and will go out and try to assassinate Trump. But you only need one or
mhm,
two, and
mhm.
we've already seen we've got two.
But I think it's pretty incredible. I
Uh,
that just we're living. I mean, on the one hand, people are telling us, I mean, Kamala Harris said in the debate, okay, violent crimes has gone down, but not at this level. I mean,
Well, I mean, first of all, apparently that assertion was wrong. I mean, it
yeah,
wasn't
yeah,
even
yeah.
true. But
Uh-huh.
but you absolutely. I mean, and of course they know it. If the situation were reversed, if there were if there had been two assassination attempts against Kamala Harris, you can imagine what all of these people would be saying. They'd be trotting out all the stories about, Charlottesville, Trump's support for white supremacists, which he didn't actually say, but they'll be regurgitating all of that. January 6th, the culture of violence on the other side, the rhetoric on the other side. No, which, to be very clear, is far less than what we get from the Democrat side. But if it was the other side, they would not hesitate. They would definitely say the rhetoric coming from the right explains the attacks on the left. I use right and left in the way that they're used amongst the
Yeah,
politicians because I don't really believe these people are either right or left on either side,
yeah.
or at least
Oh, yeah.
not in any sense that I understand. But because it's Trump.
Yeah.
They pretend that there's nothing to see there, nothing to hear there, that all of this rhetoric is really not connected to what has happened.
Yeah. And the other thing that got lots of attention in the Chinese media is, which the mainstream media should pay attention, but they don't. which is the Congress, the House passed the bill. It's basically anti-China propaganda bill.
Yeah.
It allocated $1.625 billion for 5 years to basically promote anti-China propaganda. That's what this bill is.
Yeah.
Now, so there are plenty of people, self-media people are saying, okay, this is what you accuse Russia is doing. And when Russia is doing this, I mean, we can discuss whether Russia has been doing that, but that they accuse Russia doing this. That is totally wrong. And, you know, we demand all kinds of investigation, this and that. But it's totally fine. We're doing that to China.
Yeah.
Right. And
Well, yeah, go on.
I mean, it just that's why Chinese netizens paid a lot of attention to this. Like, you haven't have enough anti-China rhetoric and propaganda. You need to double it. I mean,
Yeah, you need to double and treble it. And of course, if you make the point that you've just made, you know, that you're going to do the very thing that you accuse the Russians of. Always they trot out this thing, oh, that's whataboutism. That doesn't mean anything. With the implication that if the Americans do it, it's fine. But if anybody else does it, then it's outrageous. But that is very much, again, the assumption, the axiomatic assumption that the Americans always have in dealing with issues of this, things like this. But you're absolutely right. I mean, they're just piling on more anti-Chinese rhetoric on top of the Chinese rhetoric that already exists. They're not going to change anybody's views in China. I think that's the first thing to say. But unfortunately, this does spread poison in their own society. And we've seen that. Even many people, I mean, as you rightly say, I mean, I don't think most people in the United States are hostile to China. I don't think most people in the United States are antagonistic to China or to the Chinese culture or anything of that kind. But I think that it is creating a sort of sentiment among some people in America that there's something bad and threatening about China, even though they're never quite able to say exactly what it is.
yeah, a little bit like this assassin, right? That
Yeah,
some kind of anger issue to start with.
yeah,
They
yeah,
always need something or
yeah,
somebody to
exactly.
blame for. Yeah.
Exactly. So they've lost their job. It's
Uh-huh.
not, it's not economic forces or any whatever. It's
Mhm.
China that's responsible, or the mismanagement of the American economy. It's the Chinese who to blame.
Yeah. Speaking of which, the um the EU has this issue with Hungary. They fined
Mm,
Hungary for 200 million, I think, euro or dollar or something,
mm,
for Hungary to refuse to take illegal immigrants, right?
yeah,
Well, Sweden is now giving $34,000 to immigrants so that they can go back. I
mm,
feel like well, then
mm,
it kind of like what Sweden is doing, it's kind of like explain why Hungary is doing what it's doing, because Hungary doesn't want to get into a situation where Sweden is, that you have to pay people to leave,
mm.
right? So it's fully understandable. But the EU had got into this fight with Hungary because Hungary refused to pay the fine, and now they're taking money out of the Hungary's EU fund or something, like force them to pay.
Yeah.
I, I don't get it. Why do they so obsessed with punishing Hungary like this, where you can
Well,
see Sweden has this problem, right?
well, indeed, and Germany has now also imposed border controls to stop
Yeah.
immigrants. This has been done by Chancellor Scholz, and nobody's talking about seizing German funds or anything, or
Uh-huh.
fining Germany in that way. You're absolutely correct. They're obsessed with Hungary. They're obsessed with Viktor Orban. There's all kinds of reasons why they perceive him as pro-Russian when he's pursuing Hungarian national interests. Um, they and has a different perspective, an accurate perspective on the
Mm-hmm.
Ukraine war. They don't like him because he's a Christian, and there is a very strong anti-Christian movement in Europe at the moment, which I don't understand and can't get my head around in the slightest, but it does exist. I find it very odd. They don't like him because he goes against the demands of the EU Centre on law reforms and things of that kind. Essentially, what they don't like about Orban is that he is a sovereigntist who sees his role as representing Hungary and defending the interests of its people. Now, you might always agree with his perspectives. You might think that perhaps he's wrong in some of the positions that he's taking. Whereas the very fact that he sees himself as representing Hungary rather than being a loyal servant of the center in Brussels, that I think is what makes them angry. The government in Sweden can do what it likes, but it is 110% loyal to the EU center. The Germans, of course, are in a completely different category again. But Orban, precisely because he asserts himself and leads a country which aspires to a degree of independence, that is unacceptable.
Don't you think that EU, my observation is they do, like big countries suppress the smaller ones. So don't you think they do that? I feel that's what they're doing.
Oh, this is no question about it. There is I mean, there's a layered structure within the EU. The Germans are at the top, the French are just below them, Italy and Spain then follow them too. But those are the countries, the big countries that really matter. There's some other very important and privileged ones. The Netherlands, Sweden, Poland to some extent, though less so. But it's absolutely not the case that all countries in the EU are equal. Some are a lot more equal than others, to quote Orwell.
Well, it's a little bit surprising because I remember when there was a referendum in Sweden to join the EU. I mean, at the time, there were a lot of Swedish who was very skeptical about it because they are afraid that, it become a big country dominant the small ones. So I thought in the beginning, they were very careful of not to making the smaller countries feel that way, but they don't care anymore. It seems like that's the way it is.
No, they don't. They don't, because what eventually happens is if you join the EU, because so much power has left the states and has trickled to the center, that politicians in the states, in order to get things done, now increasingly have to look to the center rather than to their own people. And because it's at the center that so many decisions are made. And that has gradually changed their relationship, both with the center and with their people. They're more distant from their people than they were, and they're more loyal to the center than they used to be. So it's having that effect. It means that EU states, the leaders of EU states, think of themselves increasingly as more as EU people, as part of an EU project, than they do as Swedes or French or Germans or whatever. At least some of them.
A question about this immigration in general, because it's a problem here in the United States too, and EU. Why would the EU, for example, think it's a good idea just take in whatever the refugees and illegal immigrants, and why is that they are so open about this? You see, this is different in China. China really have very strict immigration policies.
Yeah.
Part of it is because China is already have a big population, so they don't feel the need for immigrants. But also, China also have historically, understand that when you have very different people coming into, it sometimes create frictions and troubles if they don't quickly absorbed by the society, which can be hard sometimes, in particular if you have a bad economy, you don't have job for everybody, and they don't speak the language. I observe that. I see that in Sweden. It's hard for people to totally being absorbed into the Swedish society if you don't speak Swedish, for example. Many of them don't. It's a totally different language, although, it's not impossible to learn, but it is a different language. And so it's hard for them to totally mix within with the society. So they have their own places, and those places, many of them do have problems, because of the high unemployment, etc. With all that, how come both EU seems you have to take in those immigrants, and the US, of course, has its border problems? Why is that?
Well, I think there's a mixture of political, economic, and ideological things. If we're talking about the EU specifically, I'm going to talk mainly about the EU because is what I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
It's important to understand that it considers it is a supranational institution. It therefore is very mistrustful by definition of assertions of nationalism. And that means that it doesn't have that sense of belonging
Mhm.
to a nation that, say, the Chinese government does. The Chinese government perceives itself as the government of the Chinese people
People.
and is there to look after their interests. And it doesn't want to be in a situation where the Chinese people are swamped by other people, because that
Yeah.
then they're no longer the Chinese people. So just as the Chinese themselves, they want their government to be there for them. I mean that I mean it's not. By the way, what we're saying is historically uncontroversial in many countries. If we're looking at the very first democracy, which was ancient Athens, which of course I know all about because I was born there. I was born in Athens. The ancient Athens had extremely strict immigration
Mhm.
policies. I mean, it never gave out its citizenship except in very particular cases as a special honor, because it was felt that if the privilege of citizenship were extended too lightly, then that would dilute the power of the sovereign people in the exercise of their own democracy. So just to say, so what we're saying is completely uncontroversial, but the European Union is a completely different category because it doesn't have that connection with any single nation, and it is deeply hostile ultimately to expressions of nationalism or of national identity.
Mhm.
So already it's going to be less um, hostile to immigration
Mhm.
than a national government might be expected to be. So that's the first thing. The second is that the whole point about the EU is freedom of movement within the
Okay.
union. And I mean, without that, the whole system starts to break down. And for that reason, again, they don't really like any step that restricts movement, because that seems to undermine the integrity of the entire project. That's
Mhm.
that's the second thing. And the third thing is, of course, they also um, have an economic logic behind this, because the EU economy is in a very
Mhm.
stagnant situation. Productivity is very low, and there is a perception, I think it's also true in Britain and in the United States, that if you want to keep economic activity going, and if
Mhm.
you want to increase your GDP, you do
Mhm.
that by importing people. And that, if it does nothing else, it increases the GDP. And I think this is a factor which is very underestimated, by the way.
Mhm.
I think that um, maintaining high rates of GDP so that you can pretend to yourself that
Mhm.
you're keeping up with China in particular is so important, that if you do that simply by importing people, or letting people come in and then paying them welfare payments, which, by the way, will increase the GDP, that is sufficient in itself to justify doing it.
They're obsessed with China, isn't it? Everything
Oh,
is
they
about
are.
China.
I think people in China underestimate the extent to which they are. It's a very dangerous obsession, but they
Yeah.
are absolutely obsessed with China. Um, both the Americans and the Europeans are. As I said, the idea that an East Asian country has risen to this level absolutely drives them wild. I mean, they can't get their heads around it at all. They don't really want to, relate to it or try to understand it, because it's something else. It's not part of the Western family. So they have to find some way to surpass it, to reduce it, to isolate it, to cut it off. And that's why we're seeing all the tensions in the world that we are.
Yeah, and in terms of in the US, I have to say it's always very puzzling to me. Okay, I myself is an immigrant, so of course I don't against the people immigrant to,
No,
one place from one
no,
place to another. But I thought you need to do it orderly, right? You need to come
no,
here legally with a visa for purpose. But
yes,
right now it's like, oh, everyone can just come in, and I mean it's called illegal immigrant for a reason, right? It is illegal. But in particular, the Democrat, it seems like you can't even use the word illegal. I mean, it is
no,
illegal, and they didn't
no,
get any permission to come in, but no, you can't say it's illegal. And then once these people coming in, they got deprived of all kinds of, I mean, they're being abused, they are not paid properly, they certainly don't have health care or any protection. So they are not having a good life here, but nobody
no,
cares. We just want them in.
yeah.
Create
Well,
all kinds of problems.
it creates huge problems. And again, of course, contrary to what many people think, it is actually contrary to American policy, at
Yeah,
least after about 1920. I mean, when the US had, as I very well remember, very strict immigration controls indeed, in the heyday of its power and prosperity and wealth, that was again taken for granted. Not anymore, it would seem.
yeah,
But I want to stress again your point about the obsession with China. It's important not people in China, I don't think understand the
mm,
extent to which it is there, and
yeah.
certainly goosing up the GDP figures, which we do all the time, in order to make it look as if our growth rate is somehow similar to China's, is very much a priority for some people.
Yeah. And we talked about this, that GDP itself is a pretty flawed way
Yeah,
of calculating things, right?
absolutely.
And just so you know that actually China is perfectly happy to have United States to be the most powerful country. China is okay with that, actually.
Yeah,
That's not a priority for China
no,
because China doesn't want to be the target. Once you are at the top, the very top, then you will be the target. One way or
yeah,
another, you will be. So China is
yeah.
actually okay. If you want to be the most
But
powerful, fine. Just leave us alone. That's all China wants.
China is not obsessed with the US. The
No, no.
US, unfortunately, is obsessed with China. That's the problem.
Okay. Just so I want to let you know that there's a movie in China it's called The Sinking of the Lisbon Maru. Do you know about this event?
No, I don't. I don't know about
Okay.
this event. Mm.
So this boat, Lisbon Maru, is the Japanese cargo ship. So during World War II, when they took Hong Kong, they took 1,800 British soldiers. So they were
Mhm.
shipping them from Hong Kong to Japan. And then
Right.
along the way, the US spotted it and then thought it was a Japanese boat. So they shoot it, and then so the boat was sinking. So these people are jumping out of the boat, and the Japanese was shooting them to kill the British soldier. And along the coast, there were Chinese fishermen all came out to pick up the British soldiers. So
Mm.
they, in the end, I think it ended up with saving 300 to 400 soldiers. Now these
Right.
soldiers were hiding in the village, the fishing village. The
Mm.
next day, the Japanese came, and then one of the leader, the British troops said, we need to come out because otherwise the Japanese they will kill everybody, the soldier, everybody in the village. So they did come out. But most of them did survive. They went to Japan and then they survived. So that's a history that apparently not
Yeah.
many people know about
No,
because
I've
of
never
course,
heard of it. I mean, that's an
yeah,
astonishing story and a
yeah,
most remarkable one, and one that people in Britain should know about. Uh,
yes,
the
I
Chinese fishermen went out and saved British soldiers in that kind of
mhm,
way. It's never, I've never heard about it.
me
And as you,
either
I'm the sort of person who does keep an ear
on
out for
these
that kind.
things. Yeah,
So that tells you that this story has been completely suppressed and memory held here,
yeah.
which is outrageous, by the way.
Yes. Now, of course, Japan would never tell this story,
Mm,
but the British should know this, right?
mm,
We're talking about 1,800 people, okay, from
mm.
Hong Kong,
Yeah,
okay. So of course there are records somewhere, but they are not
yeah,
talking about it. So this filmmaker, he is by accident heard about the story, and so he did some research, and he even went out to look for that ship. He wanted to make sure there's a ship. So they use a sonar, different kind of technology,
mm,
to have now 3D It's not it has not been taken out, but his ultimate purpose is to take that ship out. But it's very deep, and it's, it needs some work and money, etc. But anyway, it was very unfortunate. Now he invited, when he premiered this documentary, it's basically a documentary because it's true. He invited the survivors of those soldiers, and the soldiers will have all their very touching stories. You see, this is a good movie. Everybody should
Yeah.
watch. But guess what? The West has no interest to distribute
No.
this movie, or the
No.
movie festivals. Nobody seems interested in it. Isn't that very
Well, I'm not.
typical?
I am not surprised at all. Actually, I mean, I'm shocked. I am very shocked. I mean, I'm very shocked that I didn't know about this incident, by the way, which is a very important incident to know about. I'm very shocked that even I don't know about it, but I'm not
Yeah,
at all surprised. I mean, at this particular point in time, there's no interest in the West on the part of the people who exercise power in showing anything that will put the Chinese people in a good light. It's as simple as that.
yeah, and I think I'm impressed that this British leader, he actually came out together with his other soldiers because he didn't want to hurt the Chinese
Yeah,
fisher village,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So this is the I think it is a moment that you see the best of both the British people and,
Absolutely.
British soldier and the Chinese fishermen. This is
Yes.
such a positive story, I think,
Yes. Yes.
but they
Yes.
don't want you to know.
Yes. No. Well, if you go to some of the media today in Britain, the Daily Telegraph is the extreme case, but they're pretty all of them awful. The way they talk about China now is just it's very upsetting actually. But no, I find this astonishing. I find this an extraordinary story, a very moving one. It reminds me of another story, by the way, which is from the Balkans, which is that when the Germans rounded up the Jewish people in Bulgaria to send them to Auschwitz, the Bulgarian peasants, when they heard about this, they went and lay on the railway tracks to prevent the trains going. But everybody, everybody in the Balkans knows about this. In Greece, in Yugoslavia, it's there. It's famous. Not famous in the West as it should be, but it is famous in Israel, I believe, and it's certainly famous, as I said, in the Balkans as well. And showing the humanity and courage of people in the face of something of that kind. It's the same. This is the
Mhm.
same thing, but we are not allowed to know about it, it seems. And
And
that is the word. That is the right thing. We are not allowed to know about it because there is no reason why other reason why this film should not be shown in
yeah.
Britain, especially where
Mhm.
I could say that it would attract a very great deal of interest indeed.
Oh yeah.
I mean, the
Oh yeah.
British people would be very interested in this film. I mean, if you look at films of interactions between films about interactions between British prisoners of war and the Japanese, there are lots of them in
Mhm.
Britain. The most famous, of course, is the bridge over the River Kwai. But there've
Mm.
been lots of others, and it's this would be another one, and perhaps the most moving one of all. But obviously, our authorities don't want people to know about them.
And it goes back to, you talk about China has a long history of preserving history. In general, I think it because the Chinese authorities, governments always interested in preserving histories and
Yeah.
down
Yes.
to small details. But I
Yes.
find that in the West, even now, there is a law in the US saying you need to declassify what happened to the Kennedy assassination. They don't want us to know. They just don't do
No.
that. There is a
No.
law saying by
No.
2017 they should declassify everything related to both about Donald Trump and Biden. They basically breaking the law by not declassify them,
Yeah.
and
This is
nobody
very
there's no pressure for them to do that. You see?
This is very this is very true. About British history, I'm going to say straight away that the history of Britain in the last 100 years, especially from about the start of from the period before the First World War until today, has not been written accurately. I mean, there's an awful lot that has been kept secret and has not been explained, and an awful lot of records have been destroyed, by the way. But just to give one example, and it's one that I discovered about 30 years ago in a reading an American history book, which is about Pearl Harbor. But the Americans deciphered in 1940 a message transferred by the Japanese embassy in Berlin to Tokyo, in which they provided the complete record of discussions about dispositions by the British military in the Far East that had been discussed in the British War Cabinet. And clearly somebody leaked that information first to the Germans and then to the Japanese. Now that's a major event, but you will never find any reference to it in any history in Britain. No book I've ever seen in Britain writes about it.
So they're just not that interested in knowing what truly happened in history, right? There's no interest.
No. Well, there's a lot of interest, but there's also a lot of determination that most people shouldn't know, and this is a major problem. In the British, in particular, are very, very controlled in the way they keep their secrets.
Well, then you don't learn, right? If you don't know what happened, then you don't learn.
You have a very distorted understanding of your own history, if that's the case. But the British are perhaps the most skilled at this.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. Another interesting discussion with you.
Another interesting discussion. Now, speak soon. Have a great week. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.